In this presentation for the IBM Cloud Developer Certification Series, we are going to cover external authentication services for web applications in the cloud and the IBM Single Sign On service for Bluemix. This presentation will cover the concepts for using external authentication in cloud applications. It will begin by describing a very important issue that almost every application in the cloud has to address. However, few address it very well, at least at first. Then we will describe what you will understand at the completion of the training material, presentation, demo, and lab. We will cover key terms that are used in the external authentication and then describe the benefits of using external authentication. Next, the common types of identity providers will be described, followed by an overview of the high-level interaction flow common to web-based external authentications. Then we will shift to provide information on the IBM Bluemix Single Sign On service that provides external authentication services for Bluemix applications. The Single Sign On service capabilities will be outlined, the steps to configure the Single Sign On service listed, and the step-by-step flow when using IBM Single Sign On from a Java or Node.js application will be shown. This will conclude the presentation of the concepts, and the certification training module will continue with the demonstration followed by a lab where you will be able to set up a simple application using the Single Sign On service. Although it seems pretty simple to do, there are a lot of good reasons not to store user credentials within a database in your application. Securely storing passwords requires extra work, time you could be better spending on features for your app. Defining a secure way to reset passwords when they are forgotten, time you could be better spending on features for your app. Users should never use the same password credential on more than one site or application. However, they usually do. So if your application database and user credentials are compromised, it could lead to security breaches in other applications. And even if all this is done right, since your app manages its own credentials, there's no easy way for other application users or enterprise users to integrate with your application without creating another set of credentials in your own application. These statements are just about authentication. Now, many applications will have specific requirements for handling other data about users, for example profiles, that can be kept within the application in accordance with the well-specified and communicated privacy policy. But when it comes to authenticating users, you need to think about using a different way. Here are the objectives of this training module. After you've completed this module, you'll be able to explain terminology like authentication, identity, and ID token. You'll be able to describe the benefits of external authentication. You'll be able to explain the logical flow for secure external authentication. And you'll also understand how to configure and use the IBM Single Sign On service as a broker to authenticate with multiple identity source types. So that we use a common language when talking about external authentication, we will begin with a set of important terms and their definitions. Some have been shortened a little for simplicity and readability. The IBM Single Sign On service for Bluemix provides an OpenID Connect client binding. Further related terms pertain to Single Sign On implementations, and the IBM Single Sign On service can be found in the OpenID Connect specification, the link at the bottom of the page. First of all, an end user, that's a person. An entity is something with a distinct existence. An end user is an example, and the example that we'll be using in our scenario here. An identity is a set of attributes related to an entity. An end user identity would have an attribute like a name or an email address. Authentication is a process where we gain enough confidence to bind an entity to a specific identity. This is performed by an identity provider. Authorization is a separate process. It's a process where permission is granted for a request by an entity based upon a specific role, policy, or grant to that end user. Identity provider is a service capable of authenticating an end user and providing claims of identity to a client. An ID token is a token that contains claims from an authentication event. An access token is some cryptographic data that allows us to confirm the link between an entity and an identity. A client or relying party is a consumer of identity provider authentications of an entity. A web application is an example of a client or relying party in our discussion. And single sign-on is a pattern where we reuse authenticated identity from a provider across multiple applications without additional interactions from the end user. Here are some of the key benefits gained by using external authentication. It's important to note that one of the most important one is just happy users. Your application users will be happier by not having to manage another set of credentials, and it helps keep the number of sticky notes on their monitor manageable. And they can deal with password lifecycles in ways that they're already comfortable with. Enterprises using your application will know that their password policies are being followed by their employees and users. And when combined with single sign-on infrastructure, external authentication can streamline user access to your application. In many cases, users won't be even prompted to sign in if they are already authenticated by an identity provider in their browser session. We'll see more of this in the demo. Your application will have better security from the start by leveraging existing trust relationships. Since your application uses another service to provide the proof matching an entity to an identity, your application doesn't need to use multi-factor methods when new users are signed up or are provisioned. Here are some of the most common sources of external authentication. An identity provider will take information that is provided by an end user trying to access your application and use that to validate that the entity can be mapped to a specific identity. These providers can be an existing enterprise directory, a cloud-based identity or directory service, or even a social media website. The type of credentials used is not limited to user ID password combinations. Identity providers can also use multi-factor authentication when validating the entity-to-identity mapping. But with the wide possibilities for external authentication services also comes complexity in different client implementations, unless you use a broker for external authentication. And this is how the IBM Bluemix Single Sign On service helps your application perform external authentication. Here is a diagram of a simple flow for external authentication when the end user is using a web browser to access an application. In step 1, the browser requests a resource that requires authenticated access. In step 2, the application checks the request for a valid session access token. Finding none, the user is redirected to the external authentication service. In step 3, the identity provider checks to see if the user is already signed in. Finding no active session, the user is prompted to provide credentials, and this might not be a user ID and password combination. In step 4, once confirming the identity provider redirects the web browser back to the application and embeds an authorization code for use by the application. In step 5, the application uses this authorization code to obtain additional identity claims and access tokens from the identity provider. And in step 6, the application responds to the web browser request with the protected content and a session cookie that can be used in subsequent protected resource access. The IBM Single Sign On service in Bluemix allows an application developer to take a minimal coding approach to external authentication. Applications use an OpenID Connect client to interact with the Single Sign On service for Bluemix. Applications do not require detailed knowledge or special client code to access the external identity source for authentication. The service documentation includes application setup steps and sample code for Java and Node.js. A service configuration panel is used to define the identity providers and complete the integration binding to application callback functions. Supported identity providers are social media sites, Facebook, Google, LinkedIn, a simple cloud directory hosted by IBM, or a SAML enterprise identity source which can be combined with the provided Identity Bridge appliance to make use of enterprise LDAP directories. The Single Sign-On Service configuration panel provides templates that can be customized to give a specific look and feel when users are interacting with the service. For example, when selecting one of the configured identity providers for authentication, or when granting access for the application to retrieve personal information from the identity provider. This slide shows how the IBM Single Sign-On service for Bluemix works as an authentication broker to different external identity providers. The application is a consumer of these identity services through the Single Sign-On service. Regardless of the protocol, OAuth, OAuth 2, LDAP, SAML, used by the identity provider, the application always uses an OpenID Connect client binding. Authentication follows these steps. Step 1. When the user connects, the session is checked to see if it is already authenticated. Step 2. If no valid session, the application contacts the Single Sign-On service to authenticate the user. Step 3. The Single Sign-On service prompts the user to choose an identity provider for login. In this case, the user has selected a social media identity provider, and the SSO service redirects the browser to the social media login. Step 4. The social media website provides an identity challenge to the user. And Step 5. The user provides the credentials to the social media site. And Step 6. The credentials are verified, and ID information is returned to the Single Sign-On service. In Step 7, the Single Sign-On service returns identity claims, a unique identifier for the user, and the authentication realm and access token. Once the authentication is complete, the user is able to access the protected part of the application based on their permissions. And permissions may be assigned by the unique identifier, the authentication realm, or a combination of them. There isn't a lot of effort involved to add external authentication to an application when using the IBM Single Sign-On service in Bluemix. Here's a list of the high-level steps. Begin by adding the Single Sign-On service to the dashboard. Then from the control panel for the Single Sign-On service, select the identity sources to configure. Configure the settings for the identity sources. Then bind the Single Sign-On service to the application, and you can access the Integrate tab to download a module to add to your Node.js application. Insert the integration code into your application. The Bluemix documentation pages includes Node.js and Java samples, but other programming languages can be used as well, as long as you have an OpenID Connect client compatible library. Provide the callback URL and then specify one or more configured identity sources using the Single Sign-On Service Integrate tab, and then redeploy the application and access the protected URL to test out external authentication. To learn more about external authentication and the IBM Single Sign-On service for Bluemix, please watch the accompanying demo and perform the self-paced lab exercise. The online documentation link shown here includes further step-by-step information that covers topics not included in the lab, such as adding a social media identity provider and the configuration of Java applications with the Single Sign-On service. Applications use an OpenID Connect client to interact with the Single Sign-On service. If you are interested in learning more about how OpenID Connect performs external authentications, the link to the reference specification for OpenID Connect is provided here.